The first time Jasper Sullivan saw her, she was standing at the edge of his north pasture in the purple light before dawn, still as a stone marker, watching his cattle with eyes that caught the last of the night sky. He had been up since before the roosters, the way he always was in early autumn when the frost came down from the Grayville Mountains and settled into the hollow where his homestead sat. His boots crunched on the rime-covered grass as he crossed from the barn to the fence line, a lantern swinging in his left hand, a bucket of oats in his right. He had not expected company. Nobody came out this far on the Coldwater Road unless they were lost, desperate, or both. So when the silhouette resolved itself into the shape of a woman tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably not human, he stopped walking and did the thing most men on the frontier would not have done. He waited. She turned before he called out. Orcs always heard you before you thought they could, and she was no exception. She turned, and the lantern light caught her face, and Jasper Sullivan had to consciously remember to breathe. She was tall, taller than him by a good 3 inches, with the kind of build that spoke of hard living and harder work, strong arms, a powerful frame, a neck and jaw that carried the angular authority of her kind. Her skin was a deep, muted green, the color of river moss in shadow, and her tusks were small and graceful as these things went, curving up from her lower lip like the ivory handles of good knives. Her dark hair was loose, heavy as rope, falling over one shoulder. Her eyes were amber gold, the color of pine resin held to light, and they were watching him with the quiet, absolute stillness of something that had learned long ago not to flinch. She wore a fitted leather bodice, dark brown and well-worked, laced tight over a linen blouse the color of cream, the bodice cinching her waist and flaring over her hips in a way that was entirely and powerfully feminine. Her trousers were heavy canvas, tucked into knee-high boots that had been resoled more than once. A traveling pack hung from one shoulder, and a short bone-handled knife sat at her hip in a plain scabbard. Everything she wore was clean, well-maintained, and showed the signs of someone who owned very little and took exceptional care of what she had. "Morning," Jasper said. She said nothing. "You are welcome to stand there," he added, because the silence was a living thing between them, and he had always been the kind of man who preferred to fill it honestly rather than let it curdle into something worse. "But if you are hungry, I have got biscuits on the stove." She studied him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying the smell of frost and pine smoke from his chimney. "You are not afraid of me," she said. Her voice was low and even, carrying the faint roughness of an orc accent, consonants that landed harder, vowels that held longer, but her words were clean and deliberate. She had spent time learning to speak the common tongue well, and the effort of it was evident. "I have got a rifle hanging over the door if that changes," Jasper said, not unkindly. "But right now I am more worried about those biscuits burning. You coming?" She looked at him for another beat, long enough that he thought she would say no. Then she picked up the pack at her feet, he had not noticed she had set it down, and crossed the frozen grass toward him with a long, unhurried stride. Her name was Vola Grimtusk. She told him that much over the biscuits and a pot of black coffee, sitting across the rough-hewn table in his kitchen with her hands wrapped around the tin mug like she was still cold from the outside. She did not tell him where she had come from, not that morning, and he did not press. The frontier had a code about that. You did not ask a person's history until they were ready to give it. Everyone out here was running from something or toward something, and the best thing you could do was feed them and let them figure out which one it was. He told her his name, and that he ran a cattle operation, 32 head, 2 horses, a mule named Constance who had a mean streak but a good heart. He told her the nearest town was Havard, 8 miles east along the Coldwater Road, and that the mountain passes would close in another month if the weather ran true. He said these things the way he said most things, plainly and without decoration, watching her face while he talked to see if any of it mattered to her. Vola Grimtusk listened like she was cataloging everything, filing it away behind those amber eyes. She ate 3 biscuits and drank 2 cups of coffee and said almost nothing, and when she was done, she set the mug down gently on the table and looked at him with an expression he could not read. "I can work," she said. "I can see that," he said. "I am not looking for charity. I am not offering charity. I am short-handed. My last hired man went to Harvard in August and found a wife, which I cannot hold against him. The fence on the south pasture needs mending, and the firewood does not cut itself." She looked at his hands. He had the hands of a man who worked, calloused and scarred in the way honest labor produced, and something in the appraisal seemed to satisfy her. "What do you pay?" she said. He named a figure fair by any standard, the same he would have paid anyone. She nodded once sharply. "I will start on the fence today." "You can start after breakfast," he said, and pushed the biscuit plate back toward her. She stared at it. Then she took another biscuit, and Jasper Sullivan felt something in his chest settle quietly, like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. The first week, she slept outside. He had not offered the spare room yet. He had not wanted to presume, but he had assumed she would ask, or at least shelter in the barn when the temperature dropped. She did not. He found her each morning already at work, the frost on her shoulders like she had worn it there overnight, her breath making slow clouds in the cold air. She had made herself a camp at the edge of the tree line east of the barn, not quite on his land and not quite off it, and she had done it with the efficiency of someone who had been making temporary camps their entire life. A lean-to of cut branches sealed with pine boughs, a fire ring with good stones, a bedroll that she kept rolled and strapped with military neatness. He said nothing about it. He was not the kind of man who said things about things he did not understand. He understood plenty, though. Vola Grimtusk had the bearing of a woman who had never been offered a roof with honest intentions attached, and he was not about to make her feel cornered by the gesture. She would come to it in her own time, or she would not. Either way, the work she did was extraordinary. She mended the south fence in 2 days flat, doing the work of 3 men with a straightforward, methodical efficiency that left him genuinely impressed. She had a gift for reading the land. She could tell by looking at a patch of earth whether the drainage was good, whether the frost line would heave the posts come deep winter, whether the cattle had been overgrazing a section and needed rotating to the north. She knew things about horses that he had never read in any book, things she had learned from watching and doing, and Constance the mule, who hated every living creature, allowed Vola to brush her flanks without so much as a flicker of the ears. "How did you do that?" Jasper asked one afternoon, watching from the barn doorway with his arms crossed. Vola paused in her brushing and glanced at him. "I did not pretend she was not frightened," she said simply. "Most people do. They want the animal to behave, so they act like the fear is not there, but she can smell it in herself. So I just let her be afraid for a moment and let her see I was not going to punish her for it." He thought about that for the rest of the day. The second week, the weather turned. Not fully, not the killing cold that would come in December, but the mean, wet cold of early autumn in the mountains, the kind that soaked through everything and set up a permanent ache in your joints. Rain came down for 3 days straight and the temperature hovered just above freezing. He watched from the window of his cabin at night, the lantern burning low, and he thought about her out there in that lean-to with the rain coming through the pine boughs in thin silver needles. On the third night of rain, he knocked on the post of her lean-to with 2 knocks, the way you knocked on a door, and held the lantern up so she could see his face. She was awake. She was always awake when he came near her at night, and he wondered if she ever truly slept or if she only rested with one ear open, the way hunted things did. "There is a spare room," he said. "Bed is nothing fancy, but it has got a roof that does not leak." She looked at him from under the brow of her lean-to, rain dripping off the edge above her head, her amber eyes steady. "Why?" she said. It was the most important question she could have asked, and he respected her for asking it. "Because it is raining and you are wet and cold," he said. "That is the whole reason." She was quiet a long moment. He watched something work through her face, something old and complicated and wary. "I have never slept indoors," she said. He heard the weight in it. Not a complaint, not an excuse. It was a piece of her history, offered to him plainly, the way she did everything. It told him something enormous about the life she had lived and the places she had been and the people who had or had not offered her shelter. He did not say anything clever. He did not say anything sympathetic because sympathy was a distance and he did not want to be distant from whatever she was saying. He just nodded once and said, "The offer stands. Come when you want to." He went back to the cabin and left the lantern burning on the porch. She came in at midnight. Moving so quietly, he only heard her because he was still awake, lying in the dark with his eyes on the ceiling. He heard the soft sound of the door latch, the careful footsteps on the plank floor, the sound of the spare room door easing shut with deliberate gentleness, as if she was trying not to disturb a world that did not know she was in it. He never said a word about it. In the morning she was at breakfast before he was, the coffee already made and the fire stoked, and she was sitting at the table eating hardtack and dried fruit from her own pack, not having touched his stores. He sat down across from her and poured coffee and did not remark on any of it, and something in the set of her shoulders was different that morning, not softer, exactly, but less braced. Like she had been waiting for him to make it strange and he had not, and that alone had changed the air between them. They settled into a rhythm. Jasper ran the cattle operation with the quiet dedication of a man who had built his homestead from nothing. He had come out here from the flatlands of the East 7 years ago with a wagon, a horse, a set of tools, and enough stubbornness to border on a character flaw. He had cleared the land, built the cabin with his own hands, run a fence line that took him a full summer to complete. He was 31 years old, lean and brown from years of outdoor work, with dark hair that needed cutting and eyes the color of weathered oak, a steady, quiet gray-brown that seemed to see more than they gave away. He was not a man who talked much, but what he said tended to mean something. He had learned that from his father, who had been a man of even fewer words, and from the frontier itself, which had no patience for anything said without purpose. Vola worked like the land itself, steady, rhythmic, inexhaustible. She chopped firewood in a way that was almost meditative, long strokes with the axe that split clean and true, the cords she built against the barn wall growing with gratifying speed. She was extraordinary with the cattle, better than him in certain respects, able to read the herd's moods and know before he did which animal was ailing or which section of pasture was getting thin. At night, after supper, they sat by the hearth. She did not make conversation easily, and neither did he. And so they often sat in a silence that gradually stopped feeling like absence and started feeling like something else. He would read. He had a crate of books he had hauled out from the East, worn paperbacks and thick agricultural almanacs, and a few novels he revisited every winter, and she would do things with her hands, sharpening her knife, mending a worn section of her pack strap, braiding lengths of leather cord into useful shapes. One evening he looked up from his book and realized she had been watching the words on the page and not him. Her eyes tracked the lines when he turned them. "Can you read?" he asked. A long pause. "Common letters," she said. Slowly, "I had a teacher when I was young. She was human." She said the last two words with a particular weight, as if she was telling him it had been unusual and wanted him to know she understood that. "Would you like to borrow a book?" She considered this seriously, the way she considered everything. "Maybe," she said finally, "if you have got something that is not too long." He dug through the crate and found a slim volume of frontier surveying notes that he had always found oddly readable, dry as it was, because the man who had written it had clearly loved the land, and it showed through the technical language like sunlight through cracks. He handed it to her, and she took it with both hands, carefully, as if it were something that might bruise. She finished it in 4 days and set it on the table and said, "The section on reading water was wrong, about the way a river bends." He looked up from the stove. "How so?" "He says the deep channel is always on the outside of the curve, but in mountain rivers it shifts. The silt from spring melt changes it. You can find deep water on the inside of a curve in late autumn if the spring was hard." He thought about it. "That is right," he said. I had not thought about it that way. She looked at the book. He was good at some of it, she said, which was the orc equivalent of high praise, and Jasper Sullivan smiled at the pot on the stove so she would not see it and feel embarrassed for him. October deepened into true autumn. The mountains turned color and then lost it, the aspens going gold and then bare, the sky taking on the high, thin blue of serious cold approaching. Jasper rode the fence lines twice a week and Vola came with him on the second horse, a roan mare named Abby who was considerably more reasonable than Constance. And they covered the miles in easy silence, broken by practical observations about the land, the cattle, the fencing. One morning, riding along the North Ridge, where the view opened west over the valley, he pulled Abby to a halt without quite meaning to. The mountains were lit with early sun and the frost on the grass below caught it and the whole valley burned with cold light. I never get tired of it, he said, more to himself than to her. Vola was quiet beside him. Then, it looks like the Grayville from the eastern approach, she said. When I was a girl, there was a pass we used in autumn. The frost would come down and the whole mountain smelled like iron and pine. I used to wake up early to watch it. It was the most she had said about her past. He held very still, the way you held still when a wild creature came close, not wanting to startle it away. Where is your clan now? He said quietly. A silence, a long one. Gone, she said finally. The war mostly, some of fever in the year after. There are some cousins south of the Grayville in the hill country. I do not see them. I am sorry, he said. She looked at him, amber eyes catching the cold morning light. You did not make the war, she said. No, but I am still sorry for what it cost you. She turned back to the valley. Her jaw was set and her hands were steady on the reins, but something in her face had shifted, something had opened, very slightly, and he saw it before she shuddered it again. They rode back down in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from before. The trouble in Havard came in the third week of October. Jasper needed supplies: flour, lamp oil, nails, a new axle pin for the wagon, and the journey into town was unavoidable. He asked Vola if she would come, and she was quiet about it, which he understood. Havard was a border town, the kind that had seen orc raiding parties in its grandparents' time and had not fully let go of it. The prejudice ran old and deep, the way all inherited fears did. You do not have to, he said. I can manage. I need cord and leather for the harness repair, she said, which was a practical reason and also, he suspected, a way of saying that she was not going to let fear keep her off a road she had the right to travel. They drove the wagon in together, Jasper handling the reins, Vola sitting beside him on the bench with her pack in her lap and her posture exactly as easy and composed as ever. The first person they passed on the road into town, a young farmer with a load of hay on his cart, stared so hard he nearly ran his wheel into the ditch. Vola did not acknowledge it. Jasper nodded at the man as he passed, the way he always did, and kept his eyes forward. The main street of Havard was a broad, muddy lane flanked by wooden storefronts, a tavern, a blacksmith shop, a trading post, and a notice board outside the town hall that was covered in the usual collection of land claims and lost livestock notices. There were perhaps 40 people visible as they rolled down the street, and most of them turned to watch. Jasper set the brake on the wagon at the trading post and climbed down. Vola came down on her side, shouldering her pack, and the murmur that ran through the street was visible as a physical thing, heads turning, conversation stopping, a group of men outside the tavern going still with a particular quality of stillness. He walked to the trading post door and held it open for her, meeting the eyes of the man nearest the tavern, a big, ruddy man named Court Hessler, who Jasper had known by reputation for years. Court Hessler was the kind of man who had strong opinions about who belonged where, and he was looking at Vola with a flat, cold regard that Jasper recognized as the prelude to something. Inside the trading post, the owner, an older man named Weiss with wire spectacles and a permanent squint, looked at Vola over the counter and then at Jasper with an expression of complicated neutrality. "Sullivan," he said. "Weiss. I need the usual list plus an axle pin 1/4 inch. And she will need cord and harness leather. Weiss looked at Vola again. I have coin, Vola said levelly. Whatever Weiss was going to say, he decided against it. He went and pulled the items and set them on the counter and named a price, and Jasper noticed it was higher than usual but said nothing, paying it without comment because the argument was not worth having today. The trouble came outside. They had loaded the wagon, and Jasper was checking the tie-down on the supplies when Court Hessler and 2 of his companions crossed the street in a loose, deliberate triangle. Court had his thumbs in his belt and his chest pushed forward, and he stopped at the wagon's edge and looked at Vola with a contempt so old it had become a kind of language. You Sullivans, Court said to her. He did not say it like a question. He said it like an insult. Vola looked at him from the wagon bed where she had been stacking cord, and her expression was so completely still it was almost terrifying. She said nothing. I asked you a question, Greenskin, Court said. Jasper came around the front of the wagon and placed himself between Court and the wagon bed with the absolute calm of a man who had decided on something and was not going to be talked out of it. He was not a large man, lean rather, and not particularly imposing, but he had a quality of stillness that was different from Vola's. Hers was the stillness of something that had learned to survive. His was the stillness of something that did not move because it had chosen not to, and that choice was total. She works on my land, Jasper said. That means she is my concern, Court. And the way I see it, she is standing on a public road, minding her business, which is more than I can say for you right now. Court looked at him. There was a crowd gathering loosely in the street, not a mob, not yet, but the watching kind of crowd that became a mob when no one said the right thing at the right moment. Jasper was aware of every face in it. People don't want their kind here, Sullivan, Court said. His voice had dropped to the conversational register that men used when they wanted to sound reasonable about unreasonable things. Bad enough they come through on the road. You don't need to bring one into town. Havard is not your property, Jasper said, and neither is that road. The war has been over for 11 years, Jasper said, and his voice was quiet and hard and carried in the cold air. And she was not in it. He looked at Court for a moment longer, then looked at the crowd, meeting eyes where he could. Neither were most of the people standing here. Court Hessler's jaw worked. His companions exchanged a look. The crowd was watching with the attentive, uncertain quality of people who had not made up their minds yet. Then something happened that Jasper had not expected. Vola stepped down from the wagon bed, landing lightly despite her height, and she came to stand at his shoulder, not behind him, not using him as a shield but beside him. The move was deliberate. She stood in the open street with the full force of her stillness, and she looked at the crowd, not with defiance but with a steady, calm directness that was somehow harder to dismiss than defiance. I am Vola Grimtusk, she said clearly so the whole street could hear. I have worked Jasper Sullivan's land for 3 weeks. I cut his wood, I mended his fence, I tended his cattle. I paid for what I bought in that store with honest coin. She paused. I am not the war. I am a woman who is working. The silence was profound. Court Hessler looked between her and Jasper, and then at the crowd, and found that the crowd had shifted without him quite being able to say how. A few faces had gone from watching to something closer to considering. He made a sound low in his throat and said something dismissive to his companions, and they all moved back toward the tavern, not quickly enough to be called a retreat but not slowly enough to be called standing their ground. Jasper let out a breath he had been holding since he had come around the wagon. He looked at Vola. Her face was composed, but her jaw was tight and her hands at her sides were very still. You all right? He said. Yes, she said. They drove home in the afternoon light, the mountains amber in the low sun. They were 3 miles out of Havard before she said anything, and when she did, her voice had a roughness in it that she could not quite smooth out. You did not have to do that. Vola, he said. You could have let him talk. It would have been easier for you. I know, he said. I did not want to. She was quiet again, looking at the road ahead, and when she looked at him briefly, the expression on her face was something he had not seen from her before. It was not gratitude, exactly. It was older and more complicated than gratitude. It was the look of someone who had been surprised by something they had not thought still existed in the world. "Why?" she said. "Because it was wrong," he said. "That is the whole reason." She turned back to the road. The horses moved and the wagon rolled and the mountains watched from the west, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, but the silence had changed again, deepened into something that Jasper was afraid to name too quickly in case he named it wrong. November came with the first real snow. He woke up to 8 inches on the ground and more coming, the mountains swallowed in gray, the pasture white and trackless. He dressed and came to the kitchen and found Vola already there, as she always was. But this morning she was standing at the window looking out at the snow with an expression on her face that was pure and uncomplicated, the kind you only saw on adults when something had reached past all their defenses and touched them directly. "It snows in the Grayville too," she said, without looking at him. "But you could always hear the wind coming down the pass ahead of it. Here it is just quiet." "The mountains block it," he said. "The south-facing ridge takes the wind off before it gets here." She put her hand against the cold glass. "It is very beautiful," she said simply. He looked at her hand on the window, the print of her palm against the cold condensation, and he thought about the word beautiful and all the ways it could mean different things at once. The snow deepened over the following weeks, and the outdoor work changed character, becoming slower and more deliberate, about conservation and maintenance rather than building. They moved the cattle to the winter pasture with its windbreak of planted spruce, and they checked the fencing under the snow, and they kept the paths clear and the water trough from freezing. The days were short and the evenings were long, and the cabin became the center of their world. He noticed the small things, the way you notice things when you shared a space with someone and the space was tight and the winter was long. He noticed that she drank her coffee very strong and very hot. He noticed that she always faced the door, whatever room she was in, the ingrained instinct of someone who had spent a lifetime being somewhere doors did not have locks on her side. He noticed that she never hummed or sang, not because she was not musical, he suspected, but because she had been in places where being heard was dangerous. He noticed that she laughed. It happened the first time when Constance the mule, in a stunning act of malice previously unknown, got into the grain store and ate so much she made herself sick, and then stood in the barn with an expression of pure injured dignity while Jasper administered the remedy. Vola came in the middle of it and looked at the mule and then at Jasper kneeling in the hay with his shirt covered in grain and the mule's accusing stare above him, and she made a sound short, surprised, helpless, that was absolutely a laugh. She clapped her hand over her mouth. Jasper looked up at her, and the expression on his face was probably unsuitable for a man in his current condition, but he could not help it. "Thank you," he said. "That is very helpful." She lowered her hand. The laugh was still in her eyes, warm and gold as the lantern light. "She looks like she is blaming you," Vola said carefully. "She absolutely is," Jasper said. "She always does." And then something extraordinary happened, which was that Vola Grimtusk laughed again, fully this time, and it filled the barn like warmth fills a room you have just come in from the cold, and Jasper Sullivan sat in the hay with grain on his shirt and felt something in him rearrange itself permanently and irrevocably around that sound. He did not say anything about it. He was good at that. The first touch came in late November by accident, which was how these things happened between people who were careful with each other. They had been cutting firewood in the north stand of trees, working side by side in the way they had developed. He would score the round and she would split it with a force and accuracy that still impressed him. And when she swung the axe on a particularly frozen round, the head caught a knot and the handle kicked back. He was close, reaching for the next round, and the handle caught him across the wrist hard enough to sting. She dropped the axe immediately, turned to him. "Let me see," she said, and took his hand in both of hers without asking first, which was not a thing she would normally do, and they both felt the contact like a struck match. His wrist was fine red, would bruise, nothing worse. But she held his hand for a moment longer than necessary, turning it over in her larger ones, checking carefully. Her hands were warm, he noticed, and roughened in the same places his were roughened, the common topography of people who worked with their hands, and they were careful in a way that seemed at odds with their strength. She looked up and found him looking at her, and the moment hung between them like a breath held at the top of a breath. She released his hand. "It is not broken," she said. "No," he agreed. She picked up the axe and went back to work, and he rubbed his wrist without thinking about the wrist at all, thinking instead about the warmth of her hands and the way the cold air between them felt different now, charged with something that had no practical name but was absolutely real. That night by the fire she was quieter than usual, and he was quieter than usual, and the silence was a different kind again, not the comfortable working silence, and not the careful guarded silence of two people figuring each other out, but something new, something with an edge of awareness that neither of them quite knew what to do with. He got up to put more wood on the fire and came back and sat down, and this time, without planning it, he sat somewhat closer than he usually did. Not dramatically closer, they were not touching, but the distance had changed, and she knew it, and he knew that she knew it, and neither of them moved away. She was braiding cord in her hands. He watched her fingers work. "Tell me about where you grew up," he said, "if you want to." She was quiet for a moment, but it was a considering quiet, not a refusing quiet. Then she said, "We were hill country clan, not the Great War clans from the plains, smaller, older. We kept to the highland forests and the passes. My mother's mother was a hunter, best tracker the clan had. She taught me before I could properly read a trail just from watching her." "What was her name?" "Durga," she said, and the name had a richness to it, a tenderness. "She smelled like pine and iron always, even in summer." "Did she?" He hesitated. "Is she?" "The fever year," Vola said quietly. 3 years ago. She was very old. She had a good death, which is something. She turned the cord in her hands. She always said that the land does not take sides in wars. That was something she thought humans and orcs shared if they were willing to look for it, that the land just was, and if you paid attention to it, really paid attention, you could stop fighting over it long enough to see that. He sat with that. "She sounds like someone I would have liked," he said. Vola looked at him. The firelight was in her eyes, amber and gold, and the expression on her face was something that would have unraveled him if he were a lesser kind of careful. "She would have liked you," she said. "She liked people who did not talk too much." He smiled, slow. "I will take that." She smiled back, a real smile, the kind that changed the whole architecture of her face, the kind that made the tusks part of it in a way that struck him as nothing other than beautiful. He held that smile in his chest for a long time after the fire died down, and they went to their separate rooms and the cabin went quiet. December was full winter, the kind that required seriousness and preparation. Jasper had enough laid in firewood, preserved food, grain for the animals. But the work of keeping a homestead alive through a mountain winter was constant and demanding. They fell into a near-seamless collaboration, anticipating each other's needs, dividing the daily tasks with an efficiency that came from months of working together. The nights were long and deep. One night clear, the stars extraordinary above the dark mountains, he found her standing on the porch wrapped in a wool blanket looking up. He came out with his own coat and stood beside her. "I used to know all the names," she said, looking at the sky. "The orc names. My mother's mother taught me. But I have forgotten some of them." "What do you remember?" She pointed to a bright cluster near the horizon. In the common tongue it was called the hunter. She said its orc name, a word that moved through several sounds he did not have the architecture for, a word that meant something like the three who walk before the cold. He said it back badly, and she corrected him, and he tried again, and she corrected him again, and after 4 or 5 attempts she was openly, helplessly laughing, and he was laughing too, their breath making clouds in the cold air, shoulder to shoulder in the dark. He was very aware of her shoulder against his. "You will never get it," she said, still laughing. "I will practice," he said. She looked at him, her laughter settling into a smile, and the stars were above them and the cold was around them and the warm weight of her shoulder was against his, and he thought, standing there, that he could stay in this exact moment for the rest of his life without asking for anything else. He turned his face slightly toward her. She turned her face slightly toward him. "Vola," he said. "I know," she said, and that was all they said about it. But neither of them moved away, and they stood together on the porch for a long time, watching the stars and breathing the same cold air, and the distance between them, which had been carefully maintained since the first morning, was no longer quite what it had been. The kiss happened in December in the kitchen, over the most unromantic possible set of circumstances, which somehow made it more true. He had been trying to reach a high shelf, a jar of preserves he had put up in late summer that had somehow migrated to the back of the top shelf, and he was short of it by half a handwidth, stretched on his toes, when she came in from the barn and saw him and said nothing, just crossed the kitchen and reached past him and retrieved the jar with the ease of 3 inches of height advantage. She handed it to him, and he was close, very close, still half-turned from the shelf, and she was looking at him with that expression she had since the stars on the porch, the one that was aware of everything at once, and he looked at her face and her amber eyes and the line of her jaw, and he thought about nothing practical at all. He put his hand on her face, gently, his fingers against her jaw and cheek, and she went very still. Not the defensive stillness of the first weeks, but a different kind, the kind of stillness that was full rather than empty. And he kissed her softly, carefully, the way you did something you wanted to get exactly right. She kissed him back, and she was warm and present and deliberate and herself, entirely herself. And his hand moved from her jaw to the back of her neck, and he felt the weight of her hair and the warmth of her skin, and the jar of preserves was still in his other hand. And at some point he set it down on the counter without looking, without caring, without anything in his mind except the fact that this was happening and it was true, and it was the most right thing he had done in a very long time. When they separated, she looked at him, and her eyes were bright and her expression was something between wondering and certain, the way people looked when something they had been guessing at turned out to be real. "I did not know if you wanted that," he said. "I did," she said, very directly, as she did everything. He laughed soft. "Good," he said. "I have been thinking about it for a while." "How long?" she asked, with a slight raising of her brow that he was beginning to learn meant she was amused. "Since approximately the second day," he admitted. She looked at him for a moment, and then she smiled, and it was the full smile again, the one that took over her whole face and made his chest ache pleasantly, and she picked up the jar of preserves and said, "We should eat," because she was a deeply practical person, and he agreed because he was the same, and they had breakfast together with a warmth between them that had nothing to do with the stove. January and February were the deep of winter, the months where the homestead existed in a kind of suspended state, the world reduced to the cabin, the barn, the paths between them, and the wide white silence of the snowbound valley. These were the months that decided whether a partnership held. Jasper had seen men and women come apart under the pressure of winter isolation, the small frictions of shared space compounding into something unmanageable. With Vola it was the opposite. The small frictions existed. They were two strong-willed, self-sufficient people who had each spent years doing things their own way. She had opinions about how the grain should be stored. He had opinions about how the harness should be hung. She thought he was too conservative in rationing the firewood, and he thought she was too aggressive. They disagreed about these things with a directness that was occasionally terse and always honest, and they resolved them the same way, and neither of them held onto it afterward. In the evenings, he read to her. He had begun doing it somewhat accidentally. He had been reading aloud from habit, something he did when alone, and she had come in and sat down and listened, and when he stopped she had said with careful neutrality, "You do not have to stop," and so he had continued, and now it was simply a thing they did. He read from novels mostly, stories of adventure and loss and love, and she listened with her hands working and her face still, but her eyes always moving slightly with the emotion of it. One night he read a passage about a woman saying goodbye to a country she loved, and when he looked up, Vola's hands were still in her lap, and her face was turned toward the fire, and her jaw was set the way it was when she was containing something. He set the book down. He reached across the small space between them on the bench they had begun sharing, and put his hand over hers. She turned her hand over and held his, not looking at him, watching the fire, and they sat like that without talking. He had never been so certain of anything as he was in those moments. In February she told him the rest of it. They were snowbound for 3 days by a blizzard that closed the world to a white wall, and on the second night, with the wind howling in the chimney and the fire burning high and the cabin warm against the assault of winter, she talked. Not a flood, she was not that kind of person, but steadily, in the way she did everything, piece by piece. Her clan had been caught on the wrong side of the last Orcumen War, not by choice, but by geography. They had been borderland people, neither the war clans of the Great Plains nor the settled Orc communities that some of the eastern towns had made accommodation with. They had been between, which was the worst place to be during a war. Human militia had come through twice and burned the camp both times. The second time, 3 years before she came to Jasper's North pasture, there had been nothing left to rebuild. Her cousins had gone south. Her last remaining elder had died of the fever brought by the disruption. She had been alone since. She had worked the borderlands in the time since seasonal labor on farms, driving cattle for traders who were not particular about who they hired, one winter working security for a trading post in a mountain town, where the owner was old enough and practical enough not to care what she looked like. She had learned to sleep outside because the people who offered her beds tended to want things in return that she was not willing to give, and sleeping outside kept the ledger honest. She had done it for 3 years without complaint, without asking for anything from anyone, simply surviving with the relentless efficiency of a person who has decided that surviving is what they are going to do. Jasper listened to all of it. He did not try to make it better because you could not make it better, you could only receive it. His hand was in hers the whole time, and when she was done talking, he brought her hand up and pressed his mouth to her knuckles, a gesture that was not quite a kiss and not quite not a kiss, and she looked at him with those amber eyes in the firelight, and he said, "I am glad you ended up at my fence." "So am I," she said. Her voice was rough. "I was not sure I would be at first. But I am." He leaned forward and kissed her properly, slowly, and she put her free hand against his face, her thumb on his cheekbone, and they were close and warm and real, the winter raging outside and the fire going inside, and everything reduced to the exact space they occupied, which was exactly enough. They moved together, carefully, closer on the bench, and the evening deepened into something private and warm and entirely their own. The kind of intimacy that was not just physical but total, the full weight of knowing someone and being known by them, and the tenderness that arose from that trust. He held her like something precious that had traveled a long way to reach him, and she held him like someone who had not expected to find a harbor and was still slightly astonished that it was real. The night was long and warm, and the blizzard went on outside, and neither of them minded. Spring came with mud and noise, the snowmelt turning the creek at the property's edge into a roaring, joyful chaos, the cattle restless and eager for the fresh pasture, the air suddenly smelling of life again. The world woke up and expanded back to its full size, and there was an enormous amount of work to do. They did it together, as a matter of course now, as a matter of settled fact. Jasper had not made any formal declaration, and Vola had not asked for one, but the reality of them was as evident as the land around them. She had a drawer in the spare room that had become her room that now held her things, and he had stopped thinking of the cabin in terms of what was his and started thinking of it in terms of what was theirs, and they both knew this without having to make a speech about it. That spring Jasper went to Harvard without Vola, because he had business at the land office that required his signature, and also because he wanted to do something that he needed to approach from a particular angle, and doing it with Vola present would have changed the angle. He went to the notice board outside the town hall, and he took down a broadside that had been posted the previous week. A notice from the township committee about restrictions on non-human laborers that was dressed in the language of practicality, but said very plainly that orc workers on human holdings were to be registered with the committee and that their employers were to post a bond. It was not legal in any formal sense. It was a committee notice, not a law, but in a border town it carried the weight of community consensus, and community consensus in Harvard had a way of expressing itself physically when it wanted to. He folded the notice into his coat pocket and walked into the town meeting that was in progress in the hall. He stood at the back and waited until the item was raised again. The committee chairman, a plump, careful man named Aldrich Van, was explaining the notice with the manner of someone who had convinced himself he was being reasonable, and then Jasper said from the back of the room, "I have got a question." 30 heads turned. Jasper walked to the front, unhurried, and pulled the notice from his pocket and set it on the table in front of Van. "This says non-human laborers. Does it say anywhere in Harvard's charter that the township has the authority to regulate labor agreements on private land?" Van sputtered. "It is a community standard, Sullivan." "Is it a law?" "Well, strictly speaking, Jasper said. "This is a piece of paper that the committee posted without any legal authority behind it, telling free people who they can and cannot hire on their own land." He looked around the room. "Is there a lawyer in here? Because I would like to know if I am wrong." There was a long silence. The town's one lawyer, an elderly woman named Breck who kept her practice out of the back of the pharmacy and had a reputation for impartiality, said, from her seat near the window, "He is not wrong, Aldrich." The meeting moved on with considerably less confidence, and the notice was tabled for further review, which in committee language meant buried. Jasper folded his copy back into his pocket and nodded to Breck on the way out and drove home in the afternoon light feeling like the day had been reasonably well spent. He told Vola about it that evening plainly, the way he told her things. She was quiet for a long moment. "You did not have to do that," she said, again. It was a thing she said when he did things for her that she had not expected, and each time it carried the residue of all the times no one had. "Harvard is where we do our business," he said. "It matters how they treat you there." "We," she said. He looked at her. He had said it without thinking, and thinking about it now, it was absolutely the right word. "Yes," he said. She came across the kitchen and kissed him with a deliberateness and warmth that took the breath from him, and he held her there by the stove with his arms around her and her face against his neck, and the evening light came through the window, and the coffee was going cold on the counter, and he did not care about anything except the weight of her in his arms and the simple fact of her here, choosing this. April brought a rider. He arrived in the afternoon on a tired horse, a young orc man of perhaps 20, wearing the traveling colors of the Southern Hill clans. He stopped his horse at the gate and looked at the homestead with the careful assessment of someone who had been told to be careful. Vola saw him from the pasture and came to the fence and looked for a long moment, and then said something in orc tongue, a question, and the young man answered, and something moved through Vola's face too quickly for Jasper to read. He came and stood at her shoulder, which was his way of saying whatever this is, "I am here," without saying a word. The young man's name was Torak. He was a cousin, one of the cousins from the Southern Hill country she had mentioned early on. He had come to tell her that the cousins were consolidating, moving to a more settled territory near the southern foothills, and there was a place for her among them if she wanted to come south. She brought Torak in and fed him, the way you fed travelers, and Jasper made no comment on having an orc visitor in his kitchen, because there was nothing to comment on. Torak ate and looked at Jasper with the flat appraisal of a young man deciding what he thought of something, and looked at Vola with a question in his eyes that she answered with a slight shake of her head that Jasper noticed and filed. After Torek had eaten and rested, Vola walked him out to the gate and they spoke for a long time in Orc tongue, and Jasper stayed inside and did not watch because that conversation was not his and some things belonged to the person having them. When she came back in, she sat down at the table and was quiet for a moment and then looked up at him with those amber eyes and said, "I told him I am not going south." He sat down across from her. "Because of here," he said, not a question. "Because of here," she confirmed. "Because of you, because of the land." She said it carefully, like she was telling him the exact truth and wanted to be sure he had all of it. "This is where I want to be. If you want that." "Vola," he said, and his voice was rougher than he intended. "I would like nothing more in the world." She looked at him, and the expression on her face was something that did not have a name in either of their languages, something made of long roads and hard years, and the specific relief of finding at the end of them that there was a place that was yours and a person who was glad you were in it. "Good," she said and smiled, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and touched her face, and he thought, quite seriously, that he had never in his life seen anything so fine. Summer arrived, and with it the full press of the farming season. They expanded the operation that year, bringing in 10 more head of cattle and breaking a new plot of ground for a kitchen garden that Vola had proposed in spring, and that turned out to be an extraordinary success. She had an instinct for soil and growing things, understanding the way water moved and light fell and what plants needed in a way that was almost intuitive. They went a havard together every 2 weeks, regular as tide, and the town adjusted. Not warmly, not all at once, but incrementally, the way communities adjust to facts they initially resist. The staring diminished. Court Hessler made himself scarce when they were in the street. Old Breck the lawyer, who it turned out had fought beside Orc soldiers in a secondary theater of the war, and had very specific opinions about what that experience had taught her, made a point of speaking to Vola directly whenever they crossed paths, with a courtesy that was pointed and deliberate, and that Jasper appreciated enormously. The blacksmith, a young man named Pharaoh, struck up a professional conversation with Vola one afternoon about harness fittings and discovered, to his evident delight, that she had considerable knowledge of metalwork from watching a cousin who had worked a forge, and after that he greeted her without any of the careful neutrality that most of the town still maintained. Progress was the word for it, slow and uneven and real. He asked her to marry him in September, the second autumn. He did it plainly, which was the only way he knew how to do anything, in the kitchen over morning coffee, looking at her across the table with a seriousness that she recognized as the prelude to something. "I want to make this permanent," he said, "all of it, the land, the work, this." He gestured at the space between them, the table, the cabin, the whole life they had built. "I want you to be my wife if you want that." She looked at him for a long time. "What does that mean here?" she said. "For an Orc woman marrying a human man, what does that look like legally in this territory?" It was exactly the right question, and he was glad she asked it. "It means filing a claim at the land office with both names on the deed," he said, "which I have already looked into and is entirely legal, regardless of what anyone in Harvard might say about it. It means in the eyes of this territory you are my partner, you inherit the land, everything we build here is as much yours as mine. I talked to Breck about the specifics." She blinked. "You talked to Breck already." "I wanted to make sure I was offering you something real," he said, "not just a word." She was quiet, and then she stood up from the table and came around to him and put both her hands on his face, looking at him from that slight height advantage, and her expression was the most open he had ever seen it, completely present, nothing held back, no armor at all. She leaned down and kissed his forehead, and then his mouth slowly, and when she straightened up she said, "Yes." He let out a breath he had been holding since approximately the night of the blizzard. The wedding was not a grand affair. They rode to Harvard in the wagon and signed the papers at the land office with Breck as witness, and a young clerk named Nessa who had a tendency to get emotional at official ceremonies and did so appropriately. Then they went to the tavern where the owner, a large, phlegmatic woman named Greta who had a pragmatic philosophy about who she served, put a bottle of her good brandy on the table and said, "Congratulations, both of you," in the flat tone that meant she meant it. They rode home in the afternoon with the deed in Jasper's coat pocket and both their names on it, and the mountains were golden with the last of the autumn color, and he held her hand on the seat of the wagon with the reins in his other hand. "How does it feel?" he said. She considered it, looking at the road ahead, their road. "Like standing on solid ground," she said. He brought her hand up and kissed the back of it, eyes still on the road, and she leaned her head against his shoulder with the ease of someone who had stopped calculating whether it was safe and had decided that it was, completely and finally. They drove home in the low gold light, and the mountains watched, and the valley held them, and the homestead appeared around the bend with the smoke coming from the chimney, and the cattle moving quiet in the pasture, and the whole solid, built, beloved weight of everything they had made there waiting for them. That winter was the warmest of the ones Jasper could remember, or perhaps it only felt that way. They spent the evenings close by the fire, the reading continuing, the silences continuing, but so full now they needed no words to maintain them. She had learned to read well enough to take the book from him sometimes, and her voice reading the words aloud was one of the quiet pleasures of his days, that low, deliberate voice with its slightly roughened consonants, reading stories with a focused attention that gave each word its full weight. She was learning the cabin in the way she had learned the land deeply, completely, making it hers not by changing it, but by knowing it. She knew where every board creaked. She knew which window needed the latch tightened before a storm. She knew where the light fell in the morning and what it looked like in each season. She put small things in corners, a river stone with a pleasant weight, a piece of polished antler, a dried flower she had found on the north ridge in September. The cabin was full of her in the way that all spaces become full of the people who truly inhabit them, and he loved it. They talked more than they had at first. Years of practiced silence were giving way, gradually, to the particular pleasure of being heard by someone who listened the way she did, with the same complete, present attention she gave to everything. He told her about his family, his father and mother back in the flatlands, his younger sister who had married a miller and lived an entirely reasonable life nowhere near a frontier, his childhood in a small agricultural town that felt like it belonged to a different world entirely. She listened and asked questions, careful ones, the kind that went to the center of things. She asked what his father had taught him that he had kept. He thought about it for a long time. That the land requires honesty, he said. You can cut corners with people sometimes and get away with it. You cannot cut corners with the land. It will show you every dishonesty eventually. She nodded slowly. My grandmother said the same thing, she said. Different words, the same thing. And they looked at each other across the fire with the recognition of people who had come from very different places and found that the important places were the same. The baby came at the end of their 3rd year. They had talked about the possibility, carefully, honestly, the way they did things, and both of them had wanted it. And so when Vola told him simply, one February morning over coffee, "I am pregnant," he had set down his mug and looked at her with a feeling so large it had no name and reached across the table and held her hands in both of his. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. Very well. And there was a light in her face that he had never seen before, something soft and astonished and entirely new. "It is early. There will be time to prepare." He came around the table and embraced her fully, and she put her arms around him and rested her chin on top of his head, the height advantage making this easy. And they stood in the February kitchen with the cold on the windows and the fire at their backs, and held each other in the particular way of people who are holding something enormous between them. She was strong through the pregnancy, the way she was strong through everything, but he watched her with the careful attention of a man who loved someone and adjusted the work accordingly. Not by treating her as incapable, which would have earned him a sharp look and a sharper word, but by taking on the heavier tasks himself with a quiet casualness that she understood and allowed because she understood that it was love. They told no one in Harvard until it was undeniable, and when it was undeniable, the reaction was exactly as varied as he had expected. Breck sent a note of congratulations written in her precise legal hand. Greta at the tavern sent a bottle of her second-best brandy and said nothing, which was her way. Pharaoh the blacksmith, who had by now become something approximating a friend, showed up on their doorstep one afternoon with a small iron ring he had made not for jewelry, but a door hook, perfectly wrought, shaped like a bird in flight, and presented it to Vola with a gruffness that was pure affection. Court Hessler said nothing at all, which Jasper considered a significant improvement over everything he had previously said. The birth was in October, the golden season, and the child was born in the cabin with the help of a midwife from Harvard, a calm, experienced woman named Sarna who had delivered babies of every variation the frontier produced and was entirely practical about it. The child was a boy. He was born with his father's dark hair and his mother's amber eyes, with the faintest green tint to his skin, and the beginning of what would, in a few years, be small and elegant tusks. He was born in good health and with an enormous voice, and he came into the world in the cabin that had been built by Jasper's hands and made into a home by Vola's presence. And the first time Jasper held him, he was completely overwhelmed in the way that only new parents understand the specific, shattering love of a person you have just met and already known your entire life. They named him Durin. It was an orc name from Vola's grandmother's lineage, and it meant, in the old orc tongue, one who walks without stumbling. Jasper liked the name and he liked the meaning, and he said both things plainly, and Vola looked at him with those amber eyes and said, "Then Durin it is." The boy grew. He grew the way children on the frontier grew, fast, in all directions, with a hunger for the world that was impossible to fully contain. He had his father's quietness and his mother's attention, and the combination made him a peculiarly compelling small person. He followed Vola through the pastures in his small boots, watching the cattle with the same focused assessment his mother brought to everything. He sat on the bench beside Jasper in the evenings and listened to the reading with an intensity that would have been alarming in an adult. The cattle operation grew too. By the 5th year they had expanded significantly, adding a second barn and hiring a hand, a quiet, capable young man from over the mountain named Reed, who took the situation at the Sullivan homestead with perfect equanimity, and quickly developed a genuine respect for Vola that was evident in everything from the way he listened to her instructions to the way he spoke about her to the traveling merchants who came through. Word spread the way it did, and the word was that the Sullivan operation was well run and honest dealing, and the fact that the woman running half of it was an orc became, gradually, a detail rather than a fact. Not everywhere. Never everywhere. The frontier was a long and varied thing, and there were towns further out that Jasper would not take Vola to because he could not guarantee her safety there. And this was a reality they lived with, that the world was not finished changing, that some of the change they were part of had not arrived in all places yet. They lived with it practically, adjusting their routes and their dealings, building the life they had built within the freedoms that were real and working patiently at the edges of the ones that were not. In the 6th year, their second child was born, a girl this time, born in spring, with Vola's green skin and Jasper's gray-brown eyes in a combination that produced something entirely her own. They named her Marin after no one in particular, simply because they both liked it and it sounded right. Durin was 4 when Marin arrived, and he accepted the development with the seriousness he brought to all things, studying his sister in her cradle with the focused attention of a researcher, and then looking up at Vola and saying, "She is very small," with an air of thoughtful observation. "You were also very small, Vola said. Durin considered this. I do not think so, he said, and Jasper from the doorway had to leave the room. Torek came south again when the children were small, this time with his wife, a quiet orc woman with a dry humor and a talent for woodworking, and stayed for 2 weeks. They sat around the table in the evenings with the fire going and the children asleep and the brandy open, and the conversation moved between common tongue and orc tongue, and the hybrid of both that Durin was already beginning to develop, naturally and unconsciously, as children do. On the last night of Torek's visit, he pulled Jasper aside not dramatically, just stepping out to the porch with him under the pretext of checking the horses, and looked at him for a moment with those dark orc eyes. When Vola first went north, Torek said, after the last of the clan was gone, we did not know if she would survive. She had a very hard year. Before you, he paused, choosing his words with the care of a person speaking in a second language about something important. She does not say so, she would not, but I want you to know that I have seen her in both times, before and now. They are not the same person, and they are entirely the same person, and whatever you have done, it was the right thing. Jasper was quiet for a moment. She did it herself, he said. I just offered a roof, and kept my mouth shut. Torek smiled at that, the first genuine smile he had ever directed at Jasper, and it broke something open in the conversation that made the rest of the evening warm and easy. Yes, he said, but the roof mattered. They went back inside, and the fire was burning, and Vola was telling Torek's wife about the fence work in a voice that was animated and precise, gesturing with her hands the way she did when she was genuinely engaged. And Jasper stood in the doorway and watched her, and felt the same thing he felt every time he watched her speak, which was that there was nothing in the world so fine as a person wholly being themselves. She looked up and saw him in the doorway, and her expression shifted into something private and warm, the look that was only ever for him, and he crossed the room and sat beside her, and she put her hand briefly on his arm, the easy, habitual touch of a long intimacy, and went back to her story. The 7th year brought a hard spring late frost that damaged the early garden planting, a mudslide on the north ridge that took out a section of fence, and required a week of reconstruction, a bout of illness among the cattle that cost them 4 head and weeks of anxious watching over the rest. It was the kind of year that tested whether a homestead was truly a thing built to last or only something that had succeeded because conditions had been favorable. They came through it. Not easily, not without cost, but with the same quality they brought to everything steady, honest together. On the morning they confirmed that the last of the sick cattle had recovered and the herd was whole again. Vola sat on the fence rail of the winter pasture and looked at the animals moving in the morning light and said nothing for a long time, and Jasper stood beside her in the cold and said nothing too, and the quality of the silence was one he knew very well by now. It was the silence that meant that what was present was larger than words and that both of them knew it. He put his hand on her knee on the fence rail and she covered it with hers. "We are all right," he said. "Yes," she said, "we are," and they were. Durin turned 8 that autumn, and it became evident that his particular gift was for numbers. He could calculate in his head with an accuracy that made the merchant who visited the trading post blink in confusion, and he had a spatial sense about the land that suggested, as Jasper said to Vola one night, that they might eventually be working for him rather than the other way around. Marin was 4 and already showing her mother's absolute directness, making statements of fact about the world that were frequently more accurate than was comfortable, and accepting no incomplete answers. She was also, it turned out, gifted with growing things. The kitchen garden, which Vola had tended from the beginning, was beginning to become Marin's domain, the small girl moving between the beds with a focused attention and a set of questions about why and how that kept both her parents occupied for hours. The 2 children together were a particular kind of joy, half-orc in the ways that showed and fully themselves in all the ways that mattered, growing up in a house where the orc tongue and the common tongue lived side by side, where their father cooked and their mother could split a log in one stroke, where the land was a teacher and the books in the crate were another one, where love was a practical, daily, demonstrated thing. They went to Harvard for Duran's 8th birthday, a treat, a trip to the trading post where he was allowed to choose one thing for himself, and the town was familiar now, recognizable, the faces in the street a known quantity. The staring was gone. Nessa the clerk at the land office called out a hello. Pharaoh the blacksmith had a gift waiting, a small, perfect pocket knife he had made for the boy, and presented it with the proud casualness of a man who had watched a child grow up and felt himself to have contributed something to the proceedings. Old Breck, now very elderly and very much unchanged in her opinions, was sitting outside the pharmacy in the autumn sun when they walked past, and she called Vola over and said something too quiet for Jasper to hear, and Vola looked at her for a moment and then bent and embraced the small, fierce old woman with a gentleness that broke something in Jasper's chest in the best way. Later, riding home with the children asleep against each other in the wagon bed, he asked Vola what Breck had said. Vola was quiet for a moment. She said that she was glad she had lived to see it, Vola said. This, our family. She said she had not thought it would be possible when she was young, and that she was glad to have been wrong. He looked at her in the afternoon light. She has always been sharp, Vola added, which was what she said about people she loved. He covered her hand on the seat between them with his, and the horses walked, and the valley opened around them, and the mountains stood in the west in their ancient, indifferent, beautiful silence, and the children slept, and the road home was familiar and clear. There was an evening in the late autumn of the 8th year that Jasper carried with him for the rest of his life. He had come in from the barn late, the sky very dark and very clear, the stars enormous in the way they were in deep autumn when the air had shed its summer haze. The children were inside. He could hear Vola's voice reading to them, the low, deliberate music of it coming through the window. He stopped in the yard and looked up. The three who walked before the cold were right above him, bright and very close, and he said the orc name for them under his breath, still badly, still trying after all this years. Behind him the door opened. Vola came out in her wool shawl, the one she had bought in Harvard 2 winters back, and came to stand beside him. She heard him saying the name, and he felt her laugh without sound, the slight shake of her shoulders. "Still wrong," she said. "I am improving," he said. "You are determined," she allowed, which was the same thing from her. She looked up at the stars. The light was on her face, the great amber eyes, the tusks that caught the cold brightness, the strong jaw, all of it so known to him now that it was like the mountains present, essential, the shape against which he measured every other shape. "I used to look at those stars and think I was watching them alone," she said, "for a long time. And now," he said. She looked at him. The expression on her face was the fully open one, the one that still made his breath catch after 8 years, the one that showed everything. "Now," she said, "I look at them and think about how it is I got here." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, her head against his, and they stood in the yard of the homestead they had built together. The cabin with its window lit warm, the barn solid in the dark, the fence lines they had mended side by side running out into the dark like promises, and they stood and looked at the stars. From inside came the sound of the children, Duran's reading voice now, taking over from his mother, and Marin interrupting with a question about something, and the particular familiar music of a household that was fully, genuinely alive. "Look at you," Vola said softly. "You have got all of this." "We have got all of this," he said. She turned to him and kissed him in the cold night air under the stars she had watched alone for too many years, and he held her with the whole settled certainty of a man who knew exactly where he was and exactly what it meant. And above them the stars were cold and brilliant and utterly indifferent, the way the best things in the world are, present and real and asking nothing, simply there, simply burning, simply making the dark into something navigable. The homestead on the Coldwater Road grew in the years that followed into something visible from a distance, the kind of place that marked itself on the landscape. The two barns, the expanded cabin with its added room, the big kitchen garden, the cattle moving in the well-maintained pastures, the smoke rising in the evenings. Travelers on the road began to use it as a landmark, and more than once a lost or tired person knocked at the gate and was fed and pointed in the right direction, because that was the kind of place it was, because the people in it were that kind of people. Duran, at 12, could do a full day's work alongside the adults and frequently did, with the focused efficiency of a boy who had grown up watching two people who worked that way and had absorbed it completely. He had also developed, somewhat to everyone's surprise, a gift for negotiation, trading goods at the market in Harvard with a calm, measured directness that was entirely his mother and a charm that was somehow entirely his own, leaving both parties satisfied and himself modestly ahead every time. Marin at 9 was her mother's assistant in the garden and increasingly the authority on it, consulting with travelers who happened to have agricultural knowledge, incorporating what she learned into the planting with a scientific rigor that her father found both impressive and occasionally alarming. Vola, in her early 40s, had the settled quality of someone who had arrived somewhere and knew it. The wariness was still there in small ways. It never fully left people who had been shaped by hard years, but it lived at the back now, quiet, rarely needed. She had become a person of the land in the fullest sense, known to the valley, respected by the people who dealt with the Sullivan operation, and known by those who dealt with her directly as someone whose word was absolute. Jasper watched her work on an ordinary morning, the kitchen garden in early summer, moving between the beds with that unhurried efficiency, her dark hair in a braid over one shoulder, her hands in the earth, and thought, not for the first time, that he had somehow had the extraordinary luck to be in exactly the right place when she needed a fence and a roof, and someone to offer them without a price. She looked up and caught him watching. "The south fence," she said, because she always knew what he was supposed to be doing. "I am going," he said, and did not move. She gave him the raised brow that meant she was amused and not fooled. "Jasper." "I know," he said. "I am going." But he stood there another moment in the morning light just looking at her, the way you looked at things you wanted to keep exactly where they were in your memory, her face in the early summer morning, the garden behind her, the mountains above, the children's voices coming from somewhere down by the barn. "Go," she said, smiling now, the full smile. He went. The fence was solid and needed only minor attention, and he fixed it with the competence of a man who had been maintaining fences for years. And then he sat on the top rail for a moment in the mid-morning sun and looked back at the homestead, all of it, the whole assembled life of it. He thought about a morning 8 years ago, a lantern in his hand and a bucket of oats and a silhouette at the edge of his north pasture in the purple light before dawn. He thought about what he had said, something simple, something straightforward, the way he said everything and what she had said, and the long, slow unfolding of the months after, and the biscuits and the coffee and the lean-to, and the night he had gone out with the lantern and said, "There is a room, come when you want to." I have never slept indoors. He had not made it a thing. He had not said anything about it. He had simply left the lantern burning and gone to bed and let her make the choice that was hers to make, and she had made it, and everything after had followed from that single, ordinary act of respect. It did not seem like much, looked at plainly. It was just a room and a lantern and a closed mouth, but the things that mattered rarely seemed like much from the outside. They only showed their weight when you held them over time, when you felt what they had grown into, when you looked at the whole shape of what had come from a single decent moment. He climbed down from the fence rail and walked back toward the homestead. The smoke was rising from the kitchen chimney. He could hear the cattle in the far pasture. He could hear, distantly, Marin asking a question about something with the relentless precision she brought to all questions, and he could hear Vola's voice answering, patient and exact. He walked across the field in the summer morning, the the grass green and the mountains white at the peaks and the air clean and cold as water, and the homestead came toward him. And inside it the whole of his life was arranged and present, and it was good and it was real, and it was built from the ground up by two people who had each, in their different ways, come from hard places and found each other at a fence line in the dark. He pushed open the gate. He went home.